Hi, glad to see you all here. Thank you for coming, and we're going to have a good one today. I'm joined by my longtime friend, Reg Gifford. Hello, Reggie.
Hello, John.
Having a good day?
Awesome.
This is a blessing in the day. Is this the Lord's Day or not?
Well, the answer to any opposites is yes to both.
It really depends on who you talk to. We're going to look at that again
Right.
today. Before we do, would you pray for us and for all those who are listening?
Certainly. Father in heaven, we come to you. We seek your wisdom. We thank you for this opportunity to study your word with Pastor McCall. We ask that you will enlighten our minds, grant us the presence of the Holy Spirit, and we thank you for doing so in Jesus' name. Amen.
All right, we're going to plunge right in. First of all, we want to remind our viewers, go to YouTube and search under John McCall. And remember, there's a place there to subscribe. You click a button and you're subscribed. And then you'll always know what's coming up. Click like on all our videos on YouTube and share them with friends and family on social media. The best advertising is word of mouth. Okay, we're bringing something we think of value. Let's share it. Okay, in Revelation 1:9, that's where we left off. We're coming to the opening scenes of the first act of the Revelation. Now, that word act is in capitals. I want to call your attention to it. That means we have to look at the overall picture of Revelation. We are, of course, and it's interesting to me that so many commentators on Revelation, whether they are academics or simply loose cannon nuts, and they're all over the internet, forget that the Revelation divides itself, and there's a reason. Revelation divides its message into 7 parts. These parts read like the acts of a Greek play. Now, if you know anything about a Greek play, you know that there are only 3 acts in a Greek play. And here there are 7. That isn't surprising, since the capital of Roman Asia was Ephesus, which housed the oldest and largest theater in the Roman world. That's significant. That's where Revelation was sent. It made the 60-mile journey over the ocean to Ephesus, the chief port city, the entrance into Roman Asia. All right? And we're going to find out that the culture has a tremendous effect on people. Likewise, the other cities to whom the book is addressed had major theaters. It was basic to the culture. Revelation's first hearers could visualize what was happening as they heard the book read aloud by the messengers of the 7 assemblies or congregations. You know, to assemble and to congregate mean exactly the same things. A congregation is just a bunch of people who have gotten together at the same time in the same place. All right, here, this may be a little small for some of you. This is a chiasm of the entire book of Revelation. First, we have the exterior title. This would be right on the outside, the revelation of Jesus Christ. And remember, I'm talking about book, not scroll. You can't open 7 seals successively in a scroll. That's not possible. And then we have authorship, provenance, meaning place of origin and purpose. Revelation 1b to verse 3. In the prologue, Revelation 1, 4 to 8. And then for instance, there are certain words in the prologue that never appear again in Revelation until you get to the epilogue in chapter 22. We see that as is typical of a chiasm, the first half is balanced by the second half. The first half is the section we're beginning. Christ as priest judges the church on earth. And by judge, I don't mean just that he's got bad things to say and they're under judgment. I mean that he is acting as the high priest, and he gives them as much encouragement as he does talk about where the problems lie. And what's very interesting is that section there is balanced in Revelation by Revelation 21 to 22, where the church is not on earth, but it is in paradise with Christ in the new earth. All right. Next we have the Lamb who unseals the book of judgment, Revelation 4-7, and that's paralleled by the last review and judgment on the wicked in Revelation 19 and 20. We have in section D, the trumpets announce coming judgments. We're going to talk about trumpets. It's a big deal in Revelation. They appear a lot, and they're very significant. And then D prime, the final judgments on worldwide Babylon. And in the center, of course, in a chiasm, the center is where all the important stuff happens. We find the triumph of the Lamb and the 144,000 martyred host. All of this will become much clearer as we go through the details. So we're entering a body of the text at 1:9. We'll begin to study Act 1, which is the beginning of themes that will extend all through Revelation. That Revelation is a chiasm is not surprising, since that is also the format of Greek plays. We will find the exact center and theme of Revelation in Act 4, Scene 4, as will become apparent as we study. Again, if you're unfamiliar with the important concept of chiasms, please ask for the chiasm chapter from the book Sodom and the Sodomites. It is essential to correctly divide up Revelation and understand how it's constructed. I find that even scholars of immense expertise will not divide up Revelation, and certainly not correctly. Here is John writing, and this is a big issue here. I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation and the kingdom and the patient endurance that are in Jesus, was on the island called Patmos on account of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet. That verse all by itself sounds innocent enough, and yet it is the center of huge arguments about the meaning of Revelation. So we're going to look a little more at this verse. John is known to his audience. He tells us he's known to his audience. He's exiled due to the word of God and the testimony, martyrion. It's another form of that verb, martyreo, which means to witness, and it took on the meaning of to be killed as a result. It's due to the word of God and the testimony, martyrion, of Jesus, which is certainly a phrase that implies the testimony is about Jesus, it is from Jesus, and it is the testimony that Jesus bore in his earthly ministry. Which is it? Well, obviously, it's all of those things. John expects his hearers to know that. Let us remember that John was the head of these churches. The consistent witness of the post-apostolic period is that John wrote Revelation first. And that after the murder of Domitian, he was released and allowed to go back and lived out his old age, as the last chapter of the Gospel of John states. Okay? And the significance here is that we have the same kinds of things said here about John as are said in the message to the church at Ephesus, which is the capital church, all right, and certainly one of the largest churches. After all, Ephesus was the third largest city in the Roman Empire, and he's bearing with them the patient endurance that are in Jesus. He was on the island called Patmos. It's about 40 miles off the coast, about 60 miles southwest of Ephesus. On account of the Word of God, remember that Christ is described as the Word repeatedly in the Gospels, and the testimony of Jesus. I was in the Spirit, meaning that he was not cognizant of the world around him. He was meditating and was taken off. His mind was taken over, captured by the Holy Spirit. On the Lord's day, kuriake, hemera. And I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet. Let's say, we're going to have to determine what the Lord's day means. It is the center of a huge argument. The argument is, was this the Jewish Sabbath? as Mark 2 says, Christ is Lord of the Sabbath? Or was this Sunday a common phrase for Sunday? In fact, the term kuriake hemera got shortened to just kuriake, and it meant Sunday in the early church fathers. Right within 50 years of Revelation, it simply means Sunday. They wouldn't call Sunday Sunday because that would be giving authority to the sun god. Their term from it was the Lord's. The Lord's what? It meant the Lord's day. John is known to his audience very clearly. He's exiled for the testimony of Jesus he bore. He gives us the place of the exile, the cause of the exile, and the exact time which revelation was given to him. In 1:10, we have the only text in the New Testament that is used to apply to Sunday. The phrase kuriake hemera, the Lord's day, is unusual. It is not the form used in the Old Testament in reference to the day of the Lord. We have two ways we can say that in English. The day of the Lord, Lord's day. Same thing we have here. The day of the Lord is what you get in Hebrew, and the translation of the Septuagint is the day of the Lord. The Lord's day, kuriake hemera, is unusual. It's only found here and in the early writings of the church. The meaning of the phrase has been a source of endless debate about the origin of Sunday worship. Many commentators will simply say this is a reference to Sunday observance, especially since only 60 years later, the prominent early Christian leader Justin Martyr uses the exact phrase, kuriake hemera, to refer to Sunday in his famous Dialogue with Trypho, a famous rabbi of that period. He's just shortened the name Tryphon, who was a Jewish leader, and what it essentially is an argument over the nature of Christianity between a Jewish leader and a Christian leader. In it, Justin tells the Jewish leader that the Lord's day, kuriake hemera, is Sunday. Sabbatarians, of course, would not agree with the later use of the term, defining what it means in Revelation 1:10. And besides, they argue, the scriptures are clear from Christ's very own words what day would be the Lord's day. Here's a famous passage. This is an argument saying kuriake hemera in Revelation 1:10 is not Sunday, it's Saturday. Here we go. This is in the Gospel of Mark. One Sabbath he, that is Jesus, was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, the disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And you can just get the wheat just by rubbing it between your hands. The Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" You see, this little act of rubbing the grains to get the wheat and get the chaff thrown away was work. And under rabbinic laws, you couldn't work on the Sabbath. This is really one of the basic reasons why the Sabbath was given up. It had become such a burdensome, Isaiah said, to call the Sabbath holy to the Lord a delight. This was the opposite of delight. You had to really think things through because of all the things you couldn't do on Saturday. It was tough. He said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him?" This is an ouch response. It's very direct. He said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man, this term from Daniel 7, which he used to refer to himself, where you couldn't say he was claiming to be the Messiah. He just referred to what the Son of Man is going to do. Everybody understood he was talking about himself, but he couldn't be trapped. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Well, that's about as direct and blunt as it can get. That tells us that the Lord's day is the Sabbath, the weekday Sabbath, the seventh day. This would seem to be a very strong argument. A direct statement from Christ in dispute with Pharisees over the meaning of the Sabbath cannot be ignored. However, this argument would fall on deaf ears in modern Protestantism, since most Protestants have adopted the system of ages or dispensations invented by John Nelson Darby in 1833. From the viewpoint of this non-biblical but now nearly universal system, Christ's words were spoken in the Jewish age and apply only to Jews. Anything before Acts 2, the day of Pentecost, is irrelevant, because that's the day, we are told, that the Jewish age ended and the church age began. Now when you think about it, the entire Old Testament was the Jewish age, except until you come to Abraham. Before that we have the Noah age. Before that you got the Adam age. But all of that is irrelevant. Doesn't apply to us. So really, even the Gospels themselves are, well, they're interesting, but they're not to us or for us. That means most of the Bible is gone, right? Most of the Bible is gone. And that's especially funny in the book of Revelation, where there are literally hundreds and hundreds of allusions to Old Testament events piled on top of each other. Sometimes you'll get a thing like trumpets, which means several things at once, and all of them are intended. From the viewpoint of dispensationalists, what Jesus said in Mark 2 is totally irrelevant. Now, historicism and dispensationalism are systems that were created long before the resurrection of the ancient world during the last century. It is that remarkable growth of information about the Bible that allows us to do exegesis, the process of getting out of any passage what it meant to, one, the original author, and two, the original intended audience. Now, of course, John is not the author of Revelation. I'll say something here about the study of Revelation. Mostly, the study of Revelation is carried on by two groups. The first group is the nuts, loose cannons, idiots, and self-appointed interpreters that are all over the internet. These are folks who can tell you what it means without having the slightest idea of what they're talking about. They usually have their own take on it. You get absurd things. Well, the red dragon, that's China. No, it isn't. That's the kind of thing you get. So on the one hand, you have the nuts. Now, the nuts have great faith. It may be misplaced faith, but they have great faith. They don't doubt that John was supernaturally inspired. And the other group is the academics. They know the real details. Frequently, you can't find any correct background information unless you study widely in the academics. But the problem is that in general, the academics don't have any faith. They will tell you that John wrote the book of Revelation entirely. There was no vision. Jesus wasn't talking to anybody. John made it up. Once in a while, you'll find an academic that is truly an academic and has faith, but it's very rare, very, very rare. Mostly in books, even to get them published in books about Revelation, you're going to have to say that John wrote it, meaning he was the author. He invented everything in there. We're going to run up against that in several places. John was not the author of Revelation, as is usually depicted. Nevertheless, the question, what did this mean when written, can be answered absolutely and with fidelity. Oh, there's a few places where it's not clear, but in general, Revelation is an open book. You will notice that John assumes that his hearers will understand exactly what he's saying. He gives an explicit place, an explicit time, as a setting for his audience. There was clearly no need for him to elaborate what kuriake hemera meant, as he speaks as if they would know, without question, what he was referring to. Think about that. He doesn't stop to say, I mean the Lord's Day is Sunday. I mean the Lord's Day is the Sabbath. You know, those churches, Reg, were made up of three groups of people. The first, and initially the most numerous, were ex-Jews who would become Christians. And there would be a second group who was related. The Jews, specifically the Pharisees, had carried out what was called the Gentile mission. Only the Pharisees among all the sects had this concept. And Paul was of a Pharisaic background. That's what his daddy was doing in a big Greek city on the southwest of Turkey, not far from Asia. I used to feel sorry for Paul. He didn't have any life. He's traipsing around all the time, never settled down. He was beaten in one place and lied about in another place. But eventually I figured out, no, wait a minute. He didn't grow up in Jerusalem or Palestine. He was not a part of the Judean establishment. What I can say about this is his family was rich.
Yes.
Paul was a Roman citizen. That was a Roman. He got that before he was even an adult. What does that tell me about his father's business? Well, it tells me his father was very good at it. And what would his father's business have been? In that age, what you became was determined by what?
Your father.
If your father was a priest, you were going to be a priest. If your father was a tekton, meaning a contractor, then you were going to be a contractor. The people of Nazareth says, isn't this the tekton's son? Meaning, didn't Joseph? No, there was no carpenter shop. That's very romantic. Over there, just a little way from Nazareth, was the capital of Galilee. And Herod, the tetrarch, was beautifying it and making it a beautiful Greek city, putting great, huge buildings. And guess what these buildings were lined with? Wood. What was the bottom of the stage made? In the wood. So a tekton was a contractor. If by chance your daddy happened to be a contractor, what would have happened to you in that age?
I had grown up to be a contractor just like him after I learned all the different trades.
That almost happened.
Yes, exactly.
All right. So, in speaking about Paul, I can say he was just doing what he grew up to do. That was what the Gentile mission was all about. So there was this large group of former pagans who had converted to Judaism. And then, because they were converted to Judaism, Paul found them and made them what? Converts to Christ. Okay? So there's a second group. The first group is Jews. The second group is Jews who were originally pagans. And the third group, of course, is converts made directly from paganism to Christ. Right? So now we would have a very interesting thing here to deal with. The pagans would have celebrated their religion and their religious festivals on Sunday. The Jews and pagans who had become Jews would have celebrated on Saturday. And some people, according to Romans 14, celebrated every day alike. All right? Exegesis has several basic rules. One was what the author and audience would understand, and that basic rule is that context is all. What does the context tell us is the meaning of this passage and this phrase? Happily, Revelation immediately gives us an indisputable answer. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet saying, "Write what you see in a book and send it to the 7 churches." And they are enumerated deliberately. There were more than 7 assemblies in Asia. To Ephesus, and to Smyrna, and to Pergamum, and to Thyatira, and to Sardis, and to Philadelphia, and to Laodicea. And we recognize immediately a circuit. If you follow the main road around the interior of the province, this would be exactly the order in which you would meet the cities. Okay. Now, I heard a voice behind me like a trumpet. That immediately makes us stop. Where did anybody hear a voice like a trumpet?
Sinai.
At Sinai? Yeah, it was so scary. It was the giving of the law. The voice that they heard gave the Ten Commandments, and they says the people stood far off and begged Moses, tell him to talk to you and you talk to us. Please make it stop. It was scary. All right. Now, we find a little bit further on that the Day of Atonement was the great and final capstone of the religious year. It was in one of the 2 months that were New Year's months. It was a spring New Year's and a fall New Year's. And depending on which they were using at the moment, and they went back and forth in these Hebrew kingdoms, you find that the numbers don't add up between the reigns of the two kingdoms. And then Edmund Tilly found out that if you could figure out whether they were using a spring New Year or fall New Year and relate them, you could work out the sequence that they actually made sense. Okay? All right. So we find that the New Year's Day in the 7th month was, of course, celebrated as a New Year's Day. And it was, you've heard this term Rosh Hashanah. What does Rosh Hashanah mean? It means the head of the year. Okay? But it's not a biblical term. You can search for it, Ray, and you will not find it because it's a post-biblical phrase. What the church and the Hebrew believers before them had was, on the first day of the 7th month, was the Feast Teruah, which means trumpets. The trumpets announced the coming judgment. The trumpets warned you every day from that day forward that the Day of Atonement was at hand. And you'd better prepare for it. It is by far the most solemn day. Of all the annual feasts, this is the one day that, like the weekly Sabbath, you could do no work. You couldn't eat. You would afflict your souls, which means don't eat, don't do any kind of work, and just be in prayer and meditation so that you pass through this moment of crisis. That's what it was about. All right? I heard a loud voice like a trumpet. See? That makes me think immediately of the Day of Atonement. Other kinds of judgment that were connected to trumpets were they blew the trumpet to sound the alarm for war. Is war a kind of crisis where judgment is occurring? Yeah. That's closely related to the others. Then I turned, notice, I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet. Then I turned to see the voice. This is significant. We're going to find it again. That was speaking to me. And on turning, I saw 7 golden lampstands. I can stop right here. Where am I?
In the temple.
I'm in the temple, or the tabernacle that preceded it. There were 2 temples, of course. The first was built under Solomon, completed under Solomon, built by David and Solomon, and lasted nearly 400 years until it was destroyed in 586. Then, post-exile, under Ezra, Nehemiah, Joshua, Zerubbabel, a second temple was built, which by the time of Christ was being refurbished, initially by King Herod. He had thousands of workmen rebuilding that temple in a really remarkable edifice, making it the richest and most extravagant temple in the whole world. Okay? Within that temple, there was a central building, the naos. And that building was the remake of the wilderness sanctuary, which was sometimes called a tabernacle, which means a tent. The wilderness sanctuary was exactly half the size of the naos in Jerusalem. Okay? The temple that followed it was twice as big, exactly. Okay? And this one had a little vestibule. Then you went in to a big long room, twice as long as wide, called the holy place. And then there were steps up to a second room, which was covered by a veil, all the time, except on the Day of Atonement. And there was the Ark of the Covenant in the most holy place, the Ark representing the throne of God. Okay? Now, he sees the 7 golden lampstands, and that's something that nobody would normally see. Only the priests went in to the naos, the central temple. Ordinary folks weren't allowed to. Now there were Levites who went in and tended to it, who washed it and cared for the lamps and so forth. But the ordinary person never got to see this. John knows where he is. He doesn't have a problem with this. And the first thing he sees is 7 golden lampstands. He knows where he is, and he knows when he is, right? Because of what happens next. In the midst of the lampstands, one like a son of man. Immediately I stopped at this phrase. It means a human being. But remember that Ezekiel was constantly called Son of Man. The angel interpreter would say to him, Son of Man, this is what I want you to know. Meaning human guy. But now in Ezekiel's contemporary, Daniel, it becomes very significant. The judgment is set, the books are opened, and the Ancient of Days is sitting enthroned in his throne room, and one by one, the great empires rise before him, depicted as vicious beasts. Their evil nature is shown in the kind of beast they were. All right? One by one, they come before God to exercise control of the earth, and one by one they are rejected. After all that, one like a son of man enters the throne room, and he receives the kingdom. He receives the kingdom forever and ever. Okay? All the others are put down that his kingdom might come, and his kingdom would be eternal. Mary was told by Gabriel, and of his kingdom there will be no end. Okay? All right, so Jesus adopted this phrase, Son of Man. He used it in exactly a scriptural way, meaning the one who takes the kingdom from God and rules the earth forever. All right? But when he said the Son of Man, everybody knew that he was talking about himself. That was clear. And yet, he had not said that he was the Messiah. He had not said that he was the one who would receive the kingdom and rule the world forever. There were constantly spies listening to him, waiting for him to make that mistake, but he never did, because he could not shorten his ministry. Right? So here was one like a son of man. This makes me think of Daniel 7, the coming of the Son of Man to the Ancient of Days, and he is clothed with a long robe. Well, this thing is poderos. It's a Greek word, and it's the same word from which we get podiatrist. So I know by the very meaning of the title for this kind of robe what it did. It, unlike the rest of the high priestly garments, this stretched from the top all the way where? All down to the feet. That's why it was called a poderos. And with a golden sash around his chest. Oh, now wait a minute. already I have an answer to what day the Day of Atonement is. I've got that is the day on which Revelation was given. It's about judgment. It's about the end. Okay, how do I know that? Because the high priest had all these resplendent garments that he wore, each one representing something different. It was a whole uniform. And when I go back to Leviticus 16 and I read the details of the Day of Atonement, I find out that on that day, the high priest entered the sanctuary, and every time it was celebrated later in the temple, all these gorgeous robes were removed, even the crown, and all there was this simple, long robe that was worn next to the skin. That is how the high priest entered as a humble priest to open the veil and come into the exact presence of God at his throne. And now I see, oh, this is the heavenly priest, the one who receives the kingdom in Daniel 7. He's clothed as the high priest was only clothed on the Day of Atonement. Okay? The Day of Atonement could also be translated the Day of Judgment. Right? It depends. Okay, so these two verses tell me I was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. And he tells me immediately what's going on the Lord's Day. It's the day of the Lord. It's the Day of Atonement or Judgment. Right? All right. Now, this is one of literally hundreds of allusions to the Old Testament, the Bible of the first recipients of Revelation, and the reference is to the most important day of the year, Yom Kippur, the day of God's judgment and atonement. Yom Kippur was the crowning act of the holy year. It was the big feast. It was announced in advance by Teruah. How many days before the actual Day of Atonement was Teruah? 10 days. On the first day of the 7th month, you were to blow the trumpets through all the land. Throughout the land, it says in Leviticus 25. All right? And as I said, Rosh Hashanah is never mentioned in the Bible. The feast on the first day of the 7th month is Teruah, the feast of the blowing of the trumpets. This day always came in the fall, sometime between September and October. There's lots of bad weather, and the sea is roaring in Revelation. Revelation's setting is clearly the fall. Of course, it's the Day of Atonement. It's September, October. Paul knew very well when he got on that ship late in the season that they should not be going, and he commented on it. But I understand why they did. They had a ship full of paying customers and a lot of goods. They could still make it, and besides, the ship had been commandeered by the Roman army because these folks were worried. They were very, very worried because they were in charge of getting a Roman citizen to Rome because he had appealed to Caesar for a trial. Why would they be so worried? If you have been given the duty to get a Roman citizen from anywhere in the empire to the emperor, you had better succeed. Because if you didn't, and you're still alive, you won't be. Right? They were in a rush, above all else, besides paying customers, besides goods. They had a Roman citizen on board who had to be gotten to Rome. They never made it. Of course, Paul mentions being a night and a day in the ocean after the ship sank. And in Revelation, we have a lot of roaring sea. It's late in the season. It's October or September or October. It's the Day of Atonement. Now I'm going to say this. Already we have a whole bunch of things that tell us this is about the Day of Atonement. It never leaves. That's what it's all about, and it's going to be about that all the way through the book. It's already been signaled to us in the opening verses what the setting is. All right? I'll tell you an example. The rest of the messages to these 7 churches takes us all the way from 1 to 2 to 3 and ends there. Next, in 4 and 5, we're in the throne room of God. We're actually at the throne of God. So where are we now? Over here, we were in the holy place. In the next section, we're going to be where? In the most holy place. It is more emphatic what day we're on. Right? All right. It was the crowning act that came in the fall. And here we have the exact picture of his priest in the temple, dressed as he dressed only on the Day of Atonement. Day of Atonement came in the fall, September, October, depending on the year. The passage brings us back to Daniel 7, the entrance into the throne room of the Ancient of Days by one like a son of man, at a time when the term meant human being. It is used here with its exact meaning in Daniel and Revelation. Despite the ESV, English Standard Version, getting the placement of the high priest sash wrong in a related passage, here it is exactly correct in Revelation. The sash is not a belt and not worn as such. The sash, as we will prove below, is cinched at the chest. The Greek here is, he had this sash. It's the ESV that makes it a belt. He had this sash around his mastoids. Now, do you recognize that word? What's mastitis?
Infection of
Breast cancer.
Yes, an infection of the breast. We have it in people, but of course we have it all the time in cows that are being milked because they milk too much. They're overmilked, as most cows are. That's why we have some problem with cow's milk, is because so much of it is contaminated, right? Oh well, it's homogenized. It's heated to kill that. Oh, okay. So don't worry about the blood or the pus. It's homogenized. Okay? It's okay, right?
Yeah, it's all good.
It's all good. The high priest's garments were highly symbolic. Over this simple long white robe, a white, indeed white, made of linen woven only from white flax. I cannot tell you how much of Revelation is preoccupied with colors. Colors is a big deal in Revelation. You can hardly, by the time you get to the throne room, you have nothing but colors, right? Then we're going to open the seals, and it's important to find out what colors those things are, right? Color is a big deal in Revelation. One of the colors that is a big deal in Revelation is the color white. Christ is dressed as the high priest, and then we're going to find out that a whole bunch of other people in Revelation are dressed in white, right? It becomes a basic symbol of Christ's mediation and what its result is. It's a big deal. Sometimes you may not think about it, but Revelation is prepossessed with 2 things: color and the 2 signs of life, sound and motion. Right? Right? We know when we get to the throne room that we're going to hear constant praises, constant movement, right? Because those are the 2, and color. In that section, we're going to get color galore and sound and motion galore, right? Well, it's the throne of God. It's the center of the universe. It's where life flows into the universe, right? And so, what are the 2 signs of life? If I come across an accident that's just happened, and there's a body over there, this happened to me. It wasn't an accident. It was a bank robbery by a famous bank robber gang who eventually were every last one. They had just robbed this bank, and I was going to the cheap food store next door, and there he was lying there. I thought he was dead. I found out several years later in watching these FBI files where Kellstrom, a man from the home city of Worcester, was the host. He was the head of the New York office of the FBI. He had a whole program on this event, and it turned out the man lying there that I thought was dead wasn't dead and lived to tell the story of having been shot by these robbers and living through it. But now, if you came across a body, as I did, and if the person moved, what would I know? He's still alive. On the other hand, if he moaned, what else would I know? Oh, he's alive. And if he did both, well, we better attend to him. It looks like he's still with us, right? All right. So, the high priest's robes were highly symbolic. And we're going to get occasion in Revelation to look at each one of these, so we don't need to do it now. The big deal here is about the white robe. On the Day of Atonement, on that day only, the high priest wore nothing but a pair of underwear and the long white robe of the common priests. There's also a sash, and it was gold to a certain extent. And here's Exodus 39, where it's commenting on the making of these, how they made it. And they hammered out gold leaf, and he cut it. This is the man who was endowed by the Holy Spirit with the power to do all these things. He cut it, Bezalel, the son of Uri, he cut it into threads to work into the blue and purple and the scarlet yarn and into the fine twined linen in skilled design. Well, it's nice that the flax had these other colors through it. But what's going to stand out?
Shiny gold.
The gold, and it was called the gold sash.
Especially in night.
What?
Especially in bright light.
Yes. Now, of course, everything shown in the sanctuary and later the temple, why? The walls were what?
Gold.
Even these acacia wood were overlaid with gold, right? The lampstand, the table, the altar of incense were all gold. This same gold was woven into the veil where the cherubim were on the veil, right? So with the lamps flickering, you can imagine all of this light moving around inside, right? And of course, you never entered unless you had incense, so there was the movement of the incense, which represented the prayers of the saints, and the smell and so forth. It was very real world, right? So, what we have here is, in contrast, on the Day of Atonement, only the linen underwear, the long white robe, and the gold-infused sash were worn when the high priest went within the veil into the most holy place and spread the atoning blood upon the Ark of the Covenant, the miniature of God's throne. Thus the priest in symbol acted out the work of Christ. In daily ministry, the priest took some of the sacrificial atoning blood into the outer room, the holy place, which was illuminated by several golden lampstands. There were 5 on each side in the Temple of Solomon. On the Day of Atonement also, the high priest alone first ministered in the outer room before going into the second part of the ritual, entering the most holy itself at the risk of his life. In fact, there's a special thing he had to do on the Day of Atonement. The Shekinah, the glory of God, was there. It had to be dampened down or the priest might die. So he was told to take a big extra pile, pick live coals from off of the altar burnt offering, and get this, a flat pan full of incense, and get it in there. And when you open the veil, the first thing you do is pour this immense amount of incense on these live coals so that it would flare up and what would immediately fill the room? the smoke, and of course the rising incense represented what? The prayers of the saints. The people outside were praying, and first he ministered at the golden altar, which was the altar of incense, and then he placed most of it so that the glory of God would be muted, lest he die, it says. So this was really important. And that is repeated exactly in Revelation. We know what day we're on. It's the Day of Atonement. These explicit directions for this are found in the Day of Atonement ceremony, the laws in Leviticus 16. Now I want you to know something about Leviticus. It's a mystery book. Most modern Christians wouldn't read it anyway. You would get to the sin offering and the whole burnt offering and the peace offering and, right? These things had real significance. The first section of Leviticus is Leviticus 1 through 16. And that section is the manual for priests, telling the priests the correct way to carry out the atonement. This manual for priests went from Leviticus 1 to Leviticus 16. So which does it end with? You got all these directions? It ends on the Day of Atonement, where the final great day of atonement is made. This is it. This is the end of the holy year. You've got to pass through this crisis, and if you have done it right, it doesn't mean that you didn't sin. It means that atonement is made for sin. Okay, so Leviticus 16 is the end of this manual for the priests. What comes next? Well, the Holiness Code, Ray says so correctly. The Holiness Code is the moral and ethical rules of the covenant. And it ends with, the blessings and curses of the covenant in Leviticus 26. It is the content of the covenant. Okay? Now, what an interesting thing we're going to find, Ray. In Leviticus, you have first how the priests make atonement, culminating in the Day of Atonement, and the next thing you have is God telling Israel what it is that you're doing right and wrong. In Revelation, we're going to find that Christ is in the holy place, and the next thing we have is the moral and ethical directions to the 7 churches. The directions given to these 7 churches, Ray, are equivalent to the Holiness Code in Leviticus. You wouldn't know that because you weren't trained by John. But I know that he, as, the witness of the earliest church fathers is that John wrote Revelation first while he was in exile. And that after the assassination of Domitian, he was set free and went back to Ephesus and resumed his position as the head of the churches in Asia and really the head of the church. Peter was gone. Paul was gone. The church of Peter, the church of Paul. John inherited them all. Right? And now, scholars will tell us, oh no. No. There were several Johns. Whoever this John the Elder was, he was not the apostle. He never mentions being an apostle. He mentions being a prophet. Authority had long since been established, and it wasn't the days of the apostles. The apostles were long gone. We get an explanation for this in the Gospel of John. Right? What a scholar will tell you is, what this very, very strange Greek of the book of Revelation, so weird. Well, we can't be sure exactly how weird it is. It just doesn't look like the Koine Greek that Paul used, but he was a scholar. John sometimes writes Greek as if he's speaking Aramaic or Hebrew. Right? Sometimes it isn't even that. He gives little indications, as my colleague Randy would tell you, that there is stuff going on when his language is unusual. You got to look close because there's a reason. All right? I say here that Leviticus 16 is where you find the Day of Atonement. And here our much used English Standard Version makes an egregious mistake. What do I mean by egregious? Egregious means outstandingly bad or shocking. This is dumb. I don't know why they would make this mistake, but they did. Here's what it says. He, the high priest, shall put on the holy linen coat, and shall have the linen undergarment on his body, and he shall tie the sash around his waist, and wear the linen turban. These are the holy garments. He shall bathe his body in water and put them on. See that error? Where is the sash in Revelation? It's around the chest, literally the breasts. But here they put it around his waist. Okay, of course, spotting that error makes me, there's some other translations that made that mistake. I want to go see. So what do I have to do? Just look at the text in Hebrew and see what it says. Well, the words around his waist are not found in the text. They're added as an interpretation by the translators, right? Around his waist is a phrase completely missing in the Hebrew text. Let's compare. Here's the New King James translation. Okay? I'm choosing this because this is a roughly contemporary translation to the English Standard Version. And it's the King James, which most people think of as the Bible. He shall put the holy linen tunic and the linen trousers on his body. He shall be girded with a linen sash, and with the linen turban he shall be attired. These are the holy garments. Therefore he shall wash his body in water and put them on. What did you notice?
Nothing about putting on the sash.
There's no such thing as, it's just the linen sash. Doesn't say around his waist. He's to put on the sacred linen tunic with the linen undergarments next to his body, tie the sash around him, and put it on the linen turban. These are the sacred garments, so he must bathe himself with water before he puts them on. Leviticus 16:4 in the New International Version, which is very popular with conservatives. Once again, the around his waist is totally spurious. The practice in the long since destroyed temple, which collapsed in flames in AD 70 in the final Roman assault, has been recorded by first century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus. Now, he was a Jew. Flavius Josephus is obviously a Latin form, right? His name was Joseph. You put the last name first, so his last name is now Flavius. No, that was the name of the emperor who brought an end to the Roman-Jewish War from 66 to 72. It tells you something about that rebellion, that it took the Roman Empire 6 years to put it down. This was serious stuff. Now, the crazy and despicable Nero committed suicide because the Senate was going to butcher him anyway. And although he had mercilessly destroyed lots of people, he himself didn't exactly come with great, he was a coward. He made a mistake which his slave, who was his companion since he was a little boy, his slave told people what happened. He exclaimed, what a artist who's going to die in me. And then he touched the point of the dagger with his finger. When you're about to drive the dagger into your heart, you shouldn't test it first. Okay? This is a rule. And he found out that it was really sharp. And that was not a good thing. So, the slave, in disgust, grabbed the dagger from him and butchered him. There wasn't a whole... The Roman Senate was just delighted that they had finally gotten rid of Nero. But he had emptied the treasury in behalf of the poor. And for months after his death, the poor came and strewed flowers on his tomb. Yeah. But of course, he also became the first Roman emperor to explicitly and deliberately single out Christians for punishment. And you know the story, what Tacitus tells us, how he impaled Christians on crosses and set them all around his gardens, these great new gardens he had built. And he covered them in pitch. And while they were still alive, in a state of being crucified, he set them afire to light his garden parties. Right? There weren't a lot of people killed by the emperor's attack, but it was so vicious, Tacitus says, that eventually public opinion relented in favor of the Christians, who were despised because Nero was so cruel. All right? Now, what happened next is interesting. There were Roman armies stationed all around the empire. And these Roman armies, in turn, named their head, their chief, their general-in-chief, as emperor. And first, there was Galba, who became Emperor Galba. And he was put down by another Roman army, by Otho, who came and took over the emperorship. And then Vitellius came, and he also did down number 2, and he became number 3. And the most of the army was in the east, fighting the Jews. That's where the big Roman army was. And finally, the Roman army said, look, you need to go to Rome and take over and calm things down before the empire collapses. They knew him to be a good general and knew what he was doing. And here he was. He had the city of Jerusalem actually surrounded. He built a circumvallatio, which is a wall around the city, and anybody who came out, they had crucified. Josephus tells us that they were crucifying up to 2,000 people a day finally. But they stopped because they ran out of wood, even reusing wood, right? So one of the people the Romans caught in this war, before they even got to Jerusalem, was a young Jewish general. His name was Joseph. He was hiding in a cave with 3 other Jewish authorities, Jewish heads of armies, and they made a suicide pact. They knew what would happen if they fell into the hands of the Romans. So each person killed the one before him, and then Joseph was left by himself. And he surrendered to the Romans, and of course the Romans were going to crucify him, but Joseph was brought before Vespasian, and he blurted out, he had this plan, he blurted out, "You're never going to become the emperor!" And Vespasian was impressed by that. And he remembered it. And so he decided that Joseph would not be crucified. He would be taken under their wing, and he became the Jewish authority in the Roman camp to explain what was going on that the Romans didn't get. The family name of Vespasian was Flavius Vespasianus, and his son was Flavius Titus, and his other son was Flavius Domitianus. Okay? So, being adopted into the family, we know him as Flavius Josephus. He was there watching the destruction of Jerusalem from the Roman side. Now, naturally, he was considered a traitor and a quisling, those who serve the enemy. And as he reached old age, cut off from his people, he wrote 2 series of books for the intelligentsia in the Roman world. They were in Greek. The Wars of the Jews, detailing in great detail the Jewish revolt of AD 66 to 72, where he was initially a Jewish general before capture, and the Antiquities of the Jews, works of great value to modern scholarship. What he wanted to show in the Antiquities was the stories about Jews being a slave race who escaped from Egypt in the previous century, that they had gotten the story all fouled up, and he wanted to go through the whole history of the Jews so that at least the intelligentsia of the Roman world would know and gain some respect for the Jews. And in the course of this, here we have Flavius Josephus down at the bottom, Antiquities of the Jews, Book 3, Section 7, Paradigm 2. All right? And this is what he says. Over this, he, the high priest, wore a linen vestment made of fine flax doubled. It is called the chethon and denotes linen, for we call linen by the name chethon. This vestment reaches down to the feet and sits close to the body, and has sleeves that are tied fast to the arms. It is girded to the breast, a little above the elbows. Okay, here's my elbow. Yeah, that would be on my chest. By a girdle, often going round, 4 fingers broad, but so loosely woven that you would think it were a skin of a serpent. It is embroidered with flowers of scarlet and purple and blue and fine twined linen, but the warp was nothing but fine linen. The beginning of its circumvolution, that's going around, is at the breast, mastois, from which we derive mastitis for cows whose udders become infected because they're over milk. And when it has gone often round, it is there tied and hangs loosely there down to the ankles. I mean this, all the time the priest is not about any laborious service, for in this position it appears in the most agreeable manner to the spectators, but when he is obliged to assist at the offering sacrifices and to do the appointed service, that he may not be hindered in his operations by its motion, he throws it to the left and bears it on his shoulder. Okay? No, as I told you, I don't know why the ESV. Well, because that word is sometimes used for something that's wound around your waist. And so they didn't think about, we have explicit information in both Antiquities of the Jews and Revelation about where this was worded. It wasn't worn like a okay. So, and he's referring here, by the way, when it says that the high priest isn't doing anything laborious, but he has to do the sacrifices. What day is that? That's the Day of Atonement. The very instant John refers to the Lord's Day, he immediately refers to Christ's appearance in the midst of the candlesticks, which is in the holy place, prior to the phase of the ministry where he enters the most holy place. That's the next section. Right? This whole concept of Christ as high priest of a heavenly temple is drawn from the book of Hebrews. Again, the only reason that the Christians of Rome and Asia would have known this is if they knew what Hebrews said. Okay? Now, the book of Hebrews is trying to get the Christian priests away from the Temple of Jerusalem. Josephus tells us that about 1/3 of the priests were Messianists. By Messianists, he means Christians. They were accepting the idea that Jesus was the Messiah. Well, there were 18,000 priests. That's what Josephus tells us. So that means about 6,000 of them were Christians. A Christian priest should not be offering sacrifices after Christ's death. And besides, the author of Hebrews, who most certainly was an associate of Paul's, but not Paul, and the person, it's got Neoplatonism all the way through it, and there's only one person, Neoplatonism comes from Alexandria, there's only one person who was a major teacher in Paul's time who came from Alexandria. What was his name? This is where I say Bueller. Apollos. So, here's what the author of Hebrews says. It was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. He has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily, first for his own sins, and then for those of the people, since he did this once for all when he offered up himself. Brilliant. Okay? Brilliant. And that is exactly what we're going to see in Act 2 when the Lamb appears with the blood in the most holy place. How do I know it's the most holy place? There's the throne of God. Where was the throne of God? In the temple. In the most holy place. All right? We're not going to get away from this. But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, one translation says correctly, not of this reality, right? Because Platonism depends on the difference between the physical and the spiritual. Which did the Greeks like? Well, what I'm going to quote Eli Siegel. What happens when the human mind is faced with a set of opposites? The human mind, when faced with a set of opposites, tends to what? Embrace one and annihilate the other. Okay? All right? So, Platonism operates on the understanding of the difference between an idea and a physical thing. I'm sitting in a chair. Okay? And at a desk. And by the way, some of you have commented, and I appreciate it, that it looks just like they remember it. That's why I told Judy, no, the map has to be on this side. Many of you who actually saw this office when it existed in a prior reality recognize it. Here we are again, just 50 years later, that's all. Okay, so what came before this desk? Well, another desk that looked just like it. Yeah, I mean, you went away and you looked for one and you came back and brought, it was a sign. You brought one that was identical to the one I already had. Identical. Okay? All right, so what came before these desks? Before there was a physical desk of any kind, what did there have to be? There has to be an idea of a desk. The idea could take various forms. I'm glad it took this form. Now, given enough time, just given enough time, what will happen to this desk and this chair? Right away. It's unfortunate you put it that way, Ray, because that's what the Greeks said about our bodies, right? Given enough time, they're going to rot away, just like all of this stuff. If it's a physical thing, it's not ideal. Ideal is just a word that means an idea, right? What comes first? The ideal. And then we have the real. Okay? All right. So, even after we get the real, the physical thing is going to go away. But what's still there? The idea. Right? And this is the kind of Neoplatonic thought we have all the way through the book of Hebrews, that Christ is the high priest of good things that have come, through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is not of this reality. Right? He's a priest forever, right? Forever is a long time. In other words, he's the ideal priest, right? He was there before any other priest, and after all other priests are gone, he's still the priest. Because he entered once for all, his presence of high priest is the eternal Day of Atonement, right? If Christ is in the temple, then what day is it? It's the Day of Atonement. And that is what we see in Revelation 1. Now, all in caps, so this means I'm shouting. So listen. I cannot overstate this. All of the revelation is about what Christ is bringing about in the final moments of human history. Why? What was the Day of Atonement in symbol?
Judgment.
It was the end. This is where it concludes. Right? If you recognize that the setting of Revelation from beginning to end is the Day of Atonement, you have to say it's not about the Saracens. It's not about the 10 Germanic tribes that invaded Rome. It's not about the papacy. It's about what? It's about the end. Right? Now I want to couple this with cyclic time. Cyclic time is from the ancient Near East. ANE, that's how it's typically presented in academic works. The ancient Near East. And in the ancient Near East, we learned right at the outset that it could be now and then, and they could be the same thing. Right? Well, certainly the Christians in Roman Asia, facing mass extinction, recognized that they were at the end. Especially they were dealing with Domitian. There was this long-held hope that the spirit of Nero would enter another emperor. And they looked at Domitian and they saw Nero. Okay. So, they were at the end. And the more you read into the book, the further you get, the more you know it's about the end. But there's the principle of simultaneity. That is to say that things are is happening at the same time. With these facts before us, we know for sure what kuriake hemera refers to. It is the Day of Atonement or Judgment, equivalent to the common prophetic term, the Day of Yahweh. The Day of Yahweh is where accounts are settled. People either make it or they're destroyed. The Day of Yahweh is the day of God's intervention in history. The reference here is neither to Saturday nor Sunday. Revelation is about the end times. And the great time of trouble or tribulation. Trouble and tribulation are two forms of the very same word. Unlike anything preceding it or following it in all eternity. That's what Jesus Christ himself said when he was speaking about this when he was here on earth. It is to Yom Kippur, references to which run all through Revelation, as we shall see. Again, Revelation is about the last acts in the drama. The first revelation of Jesus Christ is his commencement of the heavenly judgment of the church on earth, represented especially by the 7 greater assemblies of Roman Asia as they faced mass annihilation. That is, the 7 assemblies. Well, what does 7 represent?
Completion, perfection.
Final.
Completion, perfection, final. No, it's all of those things, but something else. How much does 7 encompass?
Everything.
All of them.
If we say we're talking about Christ speaking to the 7 churches, how much of the Christian church would that represent?
All of them.
All of it. At what time?
All time.
At all times. It's part of why Yeah. It's the commencement of the heavenly judgment of the church on earth, represented especially by the 7 greater assemblies of Roman Asia. That is, the 7 assemblies represent all Christians facing the final assault of Satan on God's children as the controversy between good and evil draws to a close. Now I want you to catch something that's interesting. It represents all Christians facing the final assault. Guess what? As you look back at Christian interpretation of Revelation, what did they always think?
They were at the end.
We're at the end. And they saw in the events of their time the fulfillment of Revelation. Okay? It was always contemporary. I told you I think it was interesting to me, so interesting. Froome, in his Prophetic Faith of Our Fathers, tells us that King Richard the Lionhearted, as he was called, was on his way to a crusade. He didn't know if he should go or not. He got to Italy, he got to Sicily, and he stopped. He wanted to see somebody. He wanted to see somebody that he believed had the gift of prophecy. So he stopped because he wanted an interview. Who did he want to see? Joachim of Fury. Who else would he want to see, right? So first of all, he wanted to know, well, should I go? Joachim said yes. He had gone on a crusade and he'd stayed there for several years. He'd learned a lot about Eastern culture. That's why he was commenting on Daniel Revelation and became, as I said, the McDonald's of prophecy. What do I mean by that? You could make a better hamburger. You could make it cheaper. You could make it healthier and something that people love. You could become Whataburger, but you will never become McDonald's. No matter how good you do, you're not going to ever outshine McDonald's. Why? Well, there are Whataburgers all over a specific region, but the problem is that McDonald's is where? It's everywhere. Even in Russia and China, with their current disdain with America, haven't closed their McDonald's, right? That's the way it is. Joachim is the McDonald's of prophecy. If he said it was 1,260 days, then they meant years, then that's what that's what you're going to hear. Very few people recognize how much of what they believe came from this one man. Well, why did he say it was 1,260 years? Because the 1,000 years of the church's millennial reign, as it was claimed by St. Augustine, had long since gone by. Christ had not come, despite everybody expecting it to happen. He was far enough away so that 1,260 years had nearly passed. And he said, no, that's actually 1,260 years. He contemporized the prophecy, right? I could say, no, the 1,260 days are 2 halves of the 70th week, and it's a week of years. It's already gone from days to years. It's already been expanded. But no, he said, well, we'll expand it again, right? All right, so Richard, King of England, on his way to a crusade, wanted to hear the prophet tell him what to do, and he said, no, it's perfectly appropriate to go on this crusade. But then they fell into other questions. Richard wanted to ask the prophet about Revelation 17, the judgment on the great whore, and sitting on the beast with the 7 heads, one after another. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the beast is no more. The 6th head receives a deadly wound and then is healed. So he wanted to know, well, what do you think that is? Oh, well, Joachim had an answer. Well, there will come an evil pope who will league with an evil emperor. Remember, this was the Holy Roman Empire. And that's the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet, right? The dragon is Satan, the beast and the false prophet are an evil emperor and an evil prophet who will come at the end of the 1260 years, which is a little less than a century off. How did they see Revelation? As what? As contemporary. Richard accepted that the end of the world was at hand, and he wanted to know from the prophet, is it appropriate for me to drag my armies over to the east when we're almost at the end of time? Revelation always remained contemporary. That's why you say, well, the seven assemblies represent all Christians facing the final assault of Satan. Because century after century, that's what they believed. That's how historicism developed. That's what historicism was. We'll lengthen this out to our time, and then we'll see the fulfillment. Well, all right, so if this happened century after century, how do I have the nerve to say it wasn't then, but it is now? Right? It's a legitimate question, right?
Absolutely.
Well, the answer is very simple. Revelation says that the Antichrist will take control of how much of the world? All of it. Even people you wouldn't expect. You see the mark in the forehead or the hand. Well, if you really believe it, you'll get it in the forehead. If it's in the hand, you're just going along because you have to, like a slave. What is included? Rich and poor, free and slave, right? These folks who are pushing, as our current president is, the Great Reset. You know, the phrase for the Great Reset is, build back better. He adopted that. He says it all the time. No, these folks think that they, at the World Economic Forum, that they are going to rule the world, and the rest of us will be peons who won't own anything. And you'll like it, they have the nerve to say. Actually say, and you'll like it. Well, no. But the point is that no, they're not going to be immune to the Antichrist. They will either serve him because they believe it, or they will serve him because he has too much power to be defied. Right? That's what's in store. And that means we need to come to a place where the whole world can come under a single power. Well, now we have too many problems. For Russia and China are saying, look, what we want is a multipolar world where the United States can be the great power in some part of the world, and Russia can be the great power in some part of the world, and China can be the great power in some part of the world, and the great powers will confer with each other. It'll be a multipolar world, and we'll have to get along, and we have these yeah, but there's a problem with that. Each of these powers wants to be the sole power, and is determined to be the sole power, right? So you're not going to be able to solve the global warming crisis or the generalized warfare crisis or the lack of, as a result, the lack of food so that billions are starving, or the generalized war that causes more and more powerful weapons to be used, causing, as Revelation says, millions of people to go dead, right? That multipolar world isn't going to happen. The only way you can deal with those problems is if what? If there's a single power who can tell everybody what to do. And that's what brings the Antichrist to power. Right? The situation is untenable. The people who are left recognize that human life may end on this planet. And then, of course, they have the great help of the dead. Grandma's right there. Princess Diana's right there. Mother Teresa. Well, I said, despite my colleague laughing at me, Elvis Presley. But I read that 500,000 people still went through Graceland last year as we were coming out of the pandemic. Oh, what on earth would people want to go there for, right? That's what 500,000 people decided they wanted to do. So I'm going to add Elvis Presley anyway. But you get my point. The great people of the past who are dead will be right there, along with equally important will be what Grandma told me that only I and Grandma knew, right? And it looks like Grandma, right? Okay. So, yes, there comes a time when we are in a different situation than what they were in the time of Joachim and the visiting king. Okay? So it's quite a different situation. So that's all settled. Let's take one final brief look at the argument between Saturday and Sunday. The Sunday Sabbath, what the final events say about either. First, let's remember that Christians were drawn from various groups, especially Jews is clearly given the nod throughout Revelation. There's a lot of specific, explicit reference to Jews and Judaism in Revelation. They're still treated as significant, all right? Also, pagans who converted Judaism and from there came to learn of Christ. And finally, those who entered into Christ directly from paganism, of which there were many. In the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, AD 51, the requirements for non-Jewish Christians were remarkably direct and simple. Especially the just requirements of the law were superseded by the requirements of the covenant with Noah, which applied by definition to all mankind. The Apostle James, the brother of Christ, was heading this. It was in Jerusalem. He was the oldest living male in the family of David. He had every reason to be the chairman, right? He said, the Holy Spirit is telling me this is what we do. And what he quoted was the requirements that God gave to Noah. Why? Because we're talking about Jews and non-Jews. Both are covered by the covenant with Noah, right? More explicit requirements were given to Jews. So he says, no, these are very clear. This is what we're going to do. Where was the Sabbath? Who was the Sabbath assigned to? Well, it is explicitly stated in the Bible that the Sabbath is assigned between God and Israel, right? James does not anticipate requiring pagans to observe the Saturday Sabbath. All right? And so that's how we get to the Romans 14, where one man esteems one day, another man esteems another day, and another man esteems every day alike. And he didn't say one man sees one as holy and the other is not. He did not intend to start a war over what day you observe. He wrote the word esteems, right? And he says, just be careful about each other's consciences. Don't attack each other about what you're doing as to the Lord, all right? Now, the pagans were already in a situation where just by becoming Christians, they were risking their lives. And that's the standard. If you would rather die than disobey God, then you already have reached the standard. Paul writes, concerning the servants in Romans 14, he's very careful not to ignite a controversy about the observance of days. The Sabbath was not then a special point of controversy and would not become such until the Second Great Awakening in the mid-19th century, when Darwin's Origin of the Species was destroying God's authority as Creator and Redeemer. The great symbol of God's authority as Creator and Redeemer throughout Scripture is the Sabbath. At that moment, the issue of the true meaning of the Sabbath was reborn. At the moment, in the 1840s.
When the origin of the species was...
When the origin of the species became, at first, people said, oh, that's crazy. But when you look at his evidence, you say, oh, you know why it's such a thrilling concept? Because that's mostly what happened, right? Right. That's how life grew throughout the universe, right? This thing, this intervention, with the race of Adam. What does Adam mean? It means human being. Where God creates the human race, he skips over all the intervening things that the demons are trying to do, and simply, boom, there it is. Okay? There's the finished product. These are like all you folks living on the worlds, right? Sufficient time had passed such that the Jewish legalistic practices regarding the Sabbath, as they were in the first century, was no longer an issue. Do we hear from Sabbatarians that you only got to go a Sabbath day's journey? No. Do we hear you can't light your stove on Saturday? No. That was from that day. It was one of the chief reasons the Sabbath was no longer acceptable, and all of that has been gone. Right? Okay, and in the midst of the lampstand, one like a son of man, clothed with a long robe and with a golden sash around his chest. Boy, there was a lot of meaning in that, wasn't there? The hairs of his head were white, like white wool, like snow. Now remember, white is the color of supernatural, right? His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze refined in a furnace. His voice was like the roar of many waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars. All right, so Domitian only had one child, a little boy. He died when he was 3 or so. And he never had another child. And he had coins struck where there was the little baby and 7 stars around him. Okay. So this is something that the people in those churches would have seen. It was a divine picture. Remember? Domitian required that he be called what?
Dominus ex Dei. Et Deus.
Dominus et Deus. Lord and God. And we're going to see that very phrase in Revelation, applied to Christ. All right. He has the 7 stars. From his mouth came a sharp, 2-edged sword. His face was like the sun shining in full strength. All right. We can't ignore this, right? Right? The white wool. This makes us think of Daniel 7, the Ancient of Days, right? Who was what? This very phrase, his eyes were like flames of fire. Now, is there any reference to the color of fire in Revelation? Where? Bueller? Bueller? Yes. Have you ever heard of the Great Red Dragon?
Oh, yeah.
The red is not fire engine red. The red is fiery red, meaning kind of orangey red, right? So the Great Red Dragon has borrowed this and is making a claim by the color, right? Colors are important in Revelation. Yeah. Burnished bronze. Now you've heard of the Bronze Age, right? Lots of really beautiful and important Greek statuary was not made with stone. And it's beautiful to us the way it is. But they painted it, garish colors. Their flesh color was really obnoxious, right? They painted the eyes. In other words, we look at these beautiful statues and say, they did what? Right? You look at a building like the Parthenon on the Acropolis, And you've got to remember it was painted all kinds of bright colors. The Arch of Titus, where we see the implements from the Temple of Jerusalem, it was painted garish colors. The trumpets, the long trumpets, were painted gold, right? To them it made it look real. And that's why Revelation pays attention to color, because it was part of the culture. And the very best statuary, as far as they were concerned, were bronze statues. They made bronze statues as well as statues carved from stone. Okay? Making bronze was a big deal, right? Especially the kind of bronze that was bright and shiny and didn't fade, right? It's something that lasted in the Greek world that they liked. A human body might rot, but what?
Bronze was around for forever.
Yeah. As far as they could tell, a bronze statue that was made 200 years ago, still what? Still looked like it did the day it was made. So a point is being made here about these feet of burnished bronze, refined in a furnace. Christ walking around, it says, in the midst of the candlesticks, and he will be doing that what? Forever. His voice was like the roar of many waters. Well, the roaring ocean is mentioned in places in Revelation. If you've ever been along the sea strand when there's a big, serious storm out in the ocean, you're used to what he was living on this little island out in the Aegean, right? So it's not surprising. In his right hand he held the 7 stars. From his mouth came a sharp two-edged sword. What was this two-edged sword? Well, what was it used for?
For war.
Yeah, this is what saved you or killed you. The next one you can't miss. His face was like the sun shining in full strength. That takes away the glory from the sun and puts it where? On Christ. Okay? Yeah, so I get it. When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. Okay, now that's going to be the occasion here for what comes next. I fell at his feet as though dead. But he laid his right hand on me, saying, "Fear not." Okay. Which implies that John was terrified by what he saw. I am the first and the last, and the living one. I died. You get it? He fell at his feet as though dead. He said, I died. The real thing. Right? You can swoon because you're so terrified and collapse and go unconscious. But Jesus says, no, I really died. Well, I know what the story was. I find it in the Gospels. It still circulates. There was a book called The Passover Plot, right? There are still teachers like James Tabor who teach it. What was the story? No. It's not that he stole the body. Not at all.
Jesus never died.
He didn't die on the cross. He simply fainted, and they took him down as quickly as they could so it wouldn't be understood. Ray, that he never died. What is said here? You should be able to catch it. I died. Behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and Hades. All right, what is Hades?
The realm of the dead in the Greek world.
the realm of the dead, when we look at the Septuagint and we come to Sheol, what's the word? The Septuagint is the Greek Old Testament. What's the word? Hades. Death and the grave, or death and the realm of the dead, where the dead are. Where they are until the resurrection. Okay? I have the keys of death and Hades. Right? He says, I conquered death, and I'm the one who rules death and Sheol now. What does the Old Testament say? I can't, where can I go to get away from you? Even if went down to Sheol, what? You're still there. Right? So here we have a clear reference to that. I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and Hades. These people are what? What's their big issue?
Facing death.
They're facing death. And what does Jesus say? I understand, I was dead. But I'm alive forever, and I hold the keys to death and Hades. In other words, you could end up dead, but what?
You'll be alive.
If you're mine, then you're going to live. He explicitly says this in the messages to the 7 churches. Doesn't matter whether you're dead. You'll walk with me in white. Revelation is about to take up the meaning of each element of this description. You see, this is the description of Christ, but then some element of each of these is then applied to each of the churches, which is a way of saying that these churches all have problems. But what? I hold what? I hold the solution to every one of your problems. I don't care whether you lost your first love. I don't care whether you're arrogant and self-deceived. I don't care if you're poor. I've got all that covered because I'm all sufficient. Got it? He's the high priest for eternity. He's got the answer to the problems. Revelation is about to take up the meaning of each element. For now, we need to know that each separate thing described here is later found in one of the messages to the 7 congregations. That is, each of these things is the description. In the description is what is missing and needed for each of the churches. We will soon see each thing brought out to meet the problems of each individual assembly in the various 7 cities of Asia. Revelation is its own interpreter, and immediately Christ is going to explain some of what John is seeing. Now comes the command, coupled with the beginning of an explanation, write therefore the things that you have seen, those that are, and those that are to take place after this. As for the mystery, here's another key word. The mystery cults were the various cults that said, we have this secret to eternal life. If you join us, we'll give you the secret, and then you'll be safe forever. Right? Paul talks about the mystery of the gospel, hidden for long ages. Right? He has the mystery, but he's going to explain it. As for the mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand, and the 7 golden lampstands, the 7 stars are the messengers, angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. They're not the light, they're the platform from which the light proceeds. Things are now ready for the actual messages. The 7 stars are the messengers, who will read aloud Revelation to the churches. The lampstands, now everybody didn't read. Everybody didn't write. We couldn't assume that every Christian in Roman Asia was literate. Didn't matter. They'd seen plays, right? Mm-hmm. They could imagine they could picture what was being said. Things are now ready for the actual messages. The 7 stars are the messengers who will read aloud the revelation to the churches. The lampstands are the congregations themselves. This is the unveiling of a mystery. We see immediately that Christ will not allow the belief that the mystery religions competing with Christianity with their secret occult knowledge will be the way to overcoming death and possessing eternal life. He's just been talking about death. He's just said, I have the keys of hell and death, so he's elaborating on this. All right, Christ alone has that power. Okay. So do you think at this point, in the reading, they were anxious to hear what was going to be said to themselves and to the cities around them? I think if I were Laodicea, I could hardly wait. Why? Because I know that he's going to say bad stuff about Thyatira, right? And Sardis. I know, because we just know those people. But what? When it gets to us, you know, there's the saying, finish up strong? They figured they would finish up strong, right? That's what they thought was happening. Okay. And after all, they read the list. What number were they?
7.
They were 7. So what did that indicate? Perfection. Oh man, I'm ready for this, right? I'm ready to hear this. We saw earlier, we examined all through the book, that Revelation is a chiastic play of 7 acts, which Act 4 is the center. There we find the central theme of the whole book. It's generally the case that within each act there are 7 obvious separate sections, more properly scenes, wheels within wheels, so to speak. In Act 1 we have so far seen the introduction, and then follow messages to 7 churches. Those messages are in clear chiastic structure as seen in the following chart. Okay, we're introducing this here so that you will have it before you get to the churches. How the parallel churches are related will be explained after we look at each message individually. For instance, seeing how the message to the Ephesians and the one to the Laodiceans relate to each other, a good deal of background information needs to be understood. Okay. And this is the chiasm of the 7 assemblies. If you get the copies, you can get that. I often mention that Revelation applies to the end time, therefore our time. Because even though Revelation is a New Testament book, it is written as if it were an Old Testament book, using the assumptions of the ancient Near East. That is, as if it had been written in Hebrew or Aramaic. That is based on the idea of cyclic time, that 2 things that are basically similar or analogous can be considered as happening at the same time, even though they are far distant from each other in chronological time, which is why we say we're reading the book of Revelation not simply because it pertains to the 7 churches in Asia, but what? Yeah, it pertains to us. All right. It is, well, we are at the end here. We're going to plunge into the messages to the 7 churches. Read them if you haven't. Reread them if you have. And be careful to look at each word. In Revelation, we can hardly skip a word without losing something. And it's so important that at the end, we have this. Anyone who omits a word from this book, right? And anyone who adds a single word to this book, they're part of the lake of fire. Wow, that's...
Serious language.
Yeah. Yeah. So, when I read academics who tell us that John made it all up, I mean, they don't put it that way, but that's what they're saying. That's a very dangerous situation to be in. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.